But the common questions are, when were they discovered? What are they? Who wrote them? What's in them, right? So we're going to go through this really quickly. Then I'm going to show you some slides to illustrate these facts in case you haven't been to the site of Qumran around which the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So to some degree, I'm just going to read this to you. You can kind of read with me. So this is sort of rehearsal. Like you're studying for a test. You go like, okay, got that, got that, got that. And if at the end you've got all the points, then you're ready to go with the lecture, okay? So this is like a preliminary. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered between 47 and 56. The reason it's so late is the Temple Scroll shows up as late as 56, and Yadin had to go to a Bedouin's tent and basically grab it from there are 11 caves. Actually, Charlesworth is now saying only 10 caves really had scrolls, but we still say 11. 5 by Bedouins, 6 by archaeologists, sort of like a scorecard. 5 to 6, meaning the Bedouin really did better in many ways. The archaeologists came along looking later. They're on the upper northwest shore of the Dead Sea. The area is 13 miles east of Jerusalem. We'll see a map in a minute. It's 1,300 feet below sea level. Your ears actually pop. I was just there last week. It was 110 degrees, but it's dry heat. Actually feels kind of good, like going in a sauna. I actually enjoyed it. You feel like you're cleansing your skin and you're invigorated. And Jerusalem is 2,400 feet above sea level. You may or may not realize that. So in terms of North Carolina country, that's like Boone or something. Near the caves are the ancient ruins of Qumran, which was excavated in the 50s and appears to be connected with the scrolls. Now that's controversial because there are a few naysayers. Norman Golb, right? Hirschfeld, the late Itzhak Hirschfeld, I'm sorry, who would say the scrolls are not connected to the ruins at Qumran. I think that's incorrect. This lecture is partly about what's the latest assessment on all those kind of controversies. So here I'm just stating, appears to be connected. Like if we found stuff in your backyard that described your family and its habits fairly accurately, and the cemetery near your house where your relatives were buried, we'd say, these things appear to be connected to the Jones house here where we found them on their property. And then some people would say, well, not necessarily. Maybe the Smiths snuck in at night and buried their stuff in the Jones backyard. But the scrolls appear to be the library of a Jewish sect which was hidden away in caves around the outbreak of the Jewish-Roman War, 66. Archaeological evidence indicates the settlement had been inhabited since about 150 BC. So think of Maccabees down through the Second Revolt. Maccabees to Masada. I like the M's, don't you? That's my life. From Maccabees to Masada, this is where I live. This is what I think about when I rise up and when I sit down and when I walk along the way. I think of things that happened from 150, basically, to 73. Sometimes you can go down to Bar Kokhba, but for me, I'm really interested in Jesus in the center of that period, but the teacher of righteousness before, and these other figures we've talked about. The sect most often identified with is with the Essenes, who are mentioned by the historian Josephus and are in a few other sources, but not in the New Testament. Isn't it interesting? Jesus encounters Sadducees, Pharisees, and even a zealot is mentioned as one of his disciples, Shimon the Zealot. But we never hear about Menachem the Essene, whereas Josephus mentions the Essenes quite often. We'll see about that in a minute, because there is this group called the Herodians, right? That some have suggested might be the Essenes. They were an intensely messianic, apocalyptic, Baptist, wilderness, New Covenant group. Can you say that? As you can either make an acronym, NABWNC, and then go around writing it on walls. But I'm intending there to capture something because those things actually apply precisely to the Jesus movement as well, right? Isn't that interesting? Led by a priest they called the teacher of righteousness, who was opposed and possibly killed by the establishment. The possiblies, the appear-to-bes are trying to say, look, here's the consensus, but there's always a Larry Schiffman or a Norman Golb or a Norman Golb's son who might, you're supposed to laugh at that if you know that he was recently arrested for impersonating people on the internet, but anyway. The scrolls so far discovered, notice please the language, so far discovered, represent a library of over 900 documents representing as many as 350 separate works and multiple copies. So that gives you an idea, how many scrolls. Many of which are represented only by fragments. I think we need some other verbs rather than represent, but I'll work on that. Cave 4 alone contained 520 texts in 15,000 fragments. And actually, if you counted thumbnail with nothing on them, it would go to 75,000. But this would be 15,000 photographable fragments that you could look at and read a letter or two. So think of, there could be 10 copies of Deuteronomy. You would not have a whole Deuteronomy, but pieces of Deuteronomy. There could be 16 copies of the community rule. You might have some overlaps, but we have one complete copy that was in Cave 1 and that sort of thing. So you end up with 350 separate works. That's really the number, I think, to remember. Because if I talk about your library at home, I would say, how many books do you have in your library? You say, I have 350 books. I counted them the other day, it's about 350. That would be this library, you see. You say, yeah, but I have 3 copies of Catcher in the Rye. I don't know how that happened, but you see what I mean? But basically, they're making lots of copies. The library contains copies of scriptures, like Isaiah scroll. We'll see a picture of it in a minute. Copies of other non-canonical books. I don't like the term, but it gets the point across, meaning books that are not in the Hebrew Bible, like Enoch, and holy writings which the group itself produced. They don't really consider them scripture. It's very clear because they quote scripture. Remember, I put it in italics, like Habakkuk Pesher. They don't put it in italics, but they indicate it almost by spacing and just by the way the language goes. They say, and Habakkuk said, and this interpreted means. So you can definitely tell what they consider to be scripture. They also will write the divine name, the Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, in archaic Hebrew script sometimes in their sectarian documents, showing that they are recognizing that name as very holy. In Cave 3, there was one copper scroll found, which contains a list of 64 hiding places where gold, silver, sacred objects, and other scrolls were hidden. There's a book about the copper scroll that I would really recommend that Herschel Shanks put together. The major intact texts from Caves 1 and 11 came into Israeli hands. It's a long story, and they were published by the late 50s. They are now in the Shrine of the Book Museum in Jerusalem. Now, if you want the long story, and in a sense, if you want the long version of this handout, I would recommend only one book besides the scrolls. People who study the scrolls should get the scrolls. It'd be like, I think I'm going to study the Bible. Do you know any books about the Bible? And somebody says, yeah, why don't you get the Catholic Biblical Commentary, whatever it's called. That actually is pretty good. What's it called? Yeah, Jerome. Why don't you get the Jerome? And then you say, yeah, that'd be great. I wonder if I should get a Bible too. You ought to get a Bible too, and then read the Bible and read the Jerome Biblical Commentary. Believe it or not, people, I'm going to get a book on the scrolls. You say, have you read the scroll? No, I just want to learn about them. I don't plan to read them. What is this? You know my standard joke. I'll repeat it for the tape here so all people can hear it forever on this DVD we're making. After the scrolls were released sometime around 91 or 2, when Kathy and I were at Guilford, and they were all coming out, cover of Time magazine, and we're getting interviewed, and we were leaking things to the press, and the establishment was all angry about these texts getting suddenly put out. A woman came up to me after a lecture, and she said, Dr. Tabor, I'm just so glad we have all the scrolls now. This is just so wonderful. So I couldn't resist. I just said, and have you read the ones that we have had? I just wonder, talking about these new ones that we're now going to have. She goes, I haven't read them yet, but I plan to read them. And I just thought that was great. So she was very happy we had them all, but hadn't wanted to. Remember, we had these in the 50s. So as I've said in 2 lectures, the materials in Cave 1 plus the Damascus document really will give you just about everything I'm going to say today. And I'm not saying that I would not use all this new material. Of course, we're glad to have it all, and it does illustrate and help us to understand certain things. But the community rule is the charter of the group. So that's going to tell you quite a lot. The Habakkuk Pesher is their essential commentary on where they are in history, apocalyptically speaking, as you saw on Monday. The War Scroll is like their book of Revelation. How is it all going to end and so forth. The book of Isaiah is really their kind of banner book because they're finding their self-identity out of the prophecies of Isaiah, particularly Isaiah 40 through 66. So, and there's a couple of other things, trying to think. The Genesis Apocryphon is in Cave 1. It's not as useful, but it does help us to see other kinds of material. So the bulk of the scrolls were in Jordanian control and were placed with a team of Christian, mostly Catholic, no Jewish scholars, who over the next 4 decades published 8 volumes of material. Notice 40 years, 8 volumes. The team was left intact by the Israelis after the Six-Day War. Now, why did that matter? Well, by right of possession, Israelis who had bought the major scrolls and put them on display in the Shrine of the Book, but after 67, inherited all the scrolls because they're in the Rockefeller Museum, which is in East Jerusalem, which was Jordanian. And now it becomes the headquarters of the Israel Antiquities Authority. It's still a museum, and the scrolls are still in the basement there. So the Israelis, just like they did with the Temple Mount, they didn't really want to be very triumphant in their conquest. And so they said, well, we're not going to take over the Temple Mount and tear down the Golden Dome and the Mosque of Omar. Basically, it's a Muslim shrine, so we'll let the Muslims run it. And with the Rockefeller, we're not going to just grab the scrolls and turn them over to Israeli scholars. We'll let the DeVoe team still work on the scrolls, but we've got to speed this up. And eventually, the team was expanded by the 80s, but notice 67 to 80. And it was mainly Herschel Shanks protesting and saying, why is it that 40% of the scrolls are not yet out after like 50 years almost? And finally, Jewish scholars were included. And Emanuel Tove, now the chief editor, is Jewish. And Gene Ulrich, the assistant chief editor, is Catholic at Notre Dame. So that's kind of a nice balance. Hebrew University and Notre Dame. There should be nothing sectarian about the scrolls. Emanuel Tove and Gene Ulrich worked together like exactly the same method, exactly the same historical approach. There's nothing denominational or confessional about working on the Dead Sea Scrolls. You're studying to the best of your ability a Jewish sect of the 1st century BC and what its writings tell us. So it shouldn't matter what you are, and certainly these scholars, great scholars that they are. I taught at Notre Dame for 6 or 7 years. I know Gene very, very well. And unquestionably, they do not have any theological agenda in looking at this material. The scrolls are of great interest to both Jews and Christians. They represent for Jews a non-rabbinic form of Judaism. Now, some Jews would be pleased with that and some would not. I mean, if you're very rabbinic oriented, you'd go, oh, well, we got the library of a bunch of nuts. The way maybe Roman Catholics would look at like Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or something, a kind of a hetero-Orthodox group that's a little fringe and kind of has their own ideas. But if you're studying Judaism, how happy you are to have more of the variations that exist, with some of the Sadducean legal opinions preserved, because this group is conservative like the Sadducees, but they're also apocalyptic like Jesus, and in many ways they even parallel the Pharisees a little bit, not so much. Final interpretation of these materials with the newly released scrolls fully factored in remains open, at least till today, right? And I'm going to give you the final. Scrolls related to those found in the caves around Qumran were also found at Masada. That's important. The Herodian fortress taken over by Jewish zealots after the fall of Jerusalem in 70. They actually took it over earlier, but and finally defeated, they were taken by the Romans in 73. And number 12, since I was involved in this, and Jim Strange really is the principal investigator, an ostracon inscribed, which is an inscribed pottery sherd containing a 16-line letter written in 68 AD by someone giving their property over to the community, was discovered at the site of Qumran in January 96. And I happened to be there then and digging there, but I left, just like I left this week to be with you. I left to do a bar seminar, and they found the text 2 days later. So, but I still was there. I mean, and Dr. Strange called me immediately and, included me in on it, and it's an amazing text. It's written by one Choni, who is giving his land, his property in Jericho to the Yachad. Yachad is their name for themselves. It would be like church in Paul's letters. It's really a great word, and in my lecture to the dig group the other night, and I use Yachad instead of church to try to get across that point, because what it means, church means community or gathering, and Yachad means together. So it's the group that God has brought together as one, the Yachad. It reflects a kind of code sectarianism that we're familiar with. If you're ever around groups that are sectarian, I'm not talking about cult. I don't use that term. You can read everything I've written about that. But a sect, meaning a small group that is not part of the large mainstream religious establishment, that nonetheless feels that it is the repository of the truth, either through a prophet, a leader, or a certain interpretation. There's a certain social dynamic in that group, and there's a coded language that develops. It's a kind of a clipped shorthand. Every group does it. For example, I taught at Ambassador College, which was Herbert Armstrong's group back in the 60s. I taught Greek and Hebrew while I was getting my master's at Pepperdine University. And I remember they would say things like, well, when did you come to the truth? Now, to me, if somebody walks up and asks me, when did you come to the truth? It'd be like, what truth? What are you talking about? Like, we're all looking for truth. But in a group, it means, when did you come to know this thing we know? That's how this group was. They felt they had it, right? They had the teacher that brought the revelation. They're on track. They're chosen. It really helps to understand that dynamic, I think, because what it does is give you a sense then of how it would feel to be part of such a group. And I have a sense that I do understand that I have studied it enough to kind of get that sense. Just to orient you from the Eastern Mediterranean to the coast of what the Romans later called Palestine, or the land of Israel, or the Holy Land, here is the Dead Sea, here is the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River. You can always find Jerusalem if you just go across from the northern tip of the Dead Sea into the mountains. Right in the middle of the mountains, the coast goes down, and there's Jerusalem. Zooming in here, here's the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. This is Israel, this is Jordan. Here's the Jordan River. Jericho right here. Qumran is the settlement, and here is the cluster of caves. Notice 3 and 11 are up to the north, 1 and 2 are to the north, and then 4 through 10 are on this, at the settlement, or just literally in the backyard of the settlement. So those are the 11 caves in which there were scrolls. Now, you've seen this map before. One of the things that you want to always remember about the scrolls is, although Jerusalem is considered holy by all Jews, to the Qumranites, or to the, let's just say, to the group that wrote the scrolls, we'll leave it open for now. This city, although holy, is now defiled, and it's defiled by wicked priests who are profaning the temple, committing fornication, and basically stealing, being corrupt with money. So their idea is to leave this area. This is what it looks like today, but I'm just representing the idea. And to leave this temple, which to them was built by Herod the pig, right? And so, yeah, it's beautiful from a pagan Greco-Roman point of view, like the emperor of Rome might like it. But what does God say in Isaiah 66? Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool, so where is the house you will build for me? And so the Qumran group, as we're going to see, is the first Jewish group I know of to say, we are the temple. Now, some of you who are from Christian backgrounds would say, damn, I thought we had that distinction. Sorry. About 150 years before any Christians thought of saying, you are the temple, we are the temple, they're already saying, we have built a temple of men in the wilderness in which God's Holy Spirit will dwell. This is what it looks like as you head out on the main highway, that's the Mount of Olives, out into the stark wilderness of Judea. It's only 13 miles, but you're going to drop from 2,600 feet to 13 feet below, and you see things like this along the way, especially if you get off the road and go around Wadi Kelt. It's really rugged, spectacular, and inhabited mostly by Bedouin. In the spring, it turns green with flowers, though. So that's really sort of interesting. And you finally then arrive back here at this area. Now, the Jordan River, this is the northern part of the Jordan, runs all the way down into the Dead Sea, where there's no outlet, and that's why it's called the Dead Sea, so it's filled up with salt and minerals and silt. But up to the north in the Galilee, John the Baptist is baptizing. Many people mistakenly put John down by Qumran, right? How many times have I heard that? But the only geography we have in Mark is he's at the Jordan. That didn't tell you where. It's a long river. But John, the Gospel of John says he is near Anan Salim, which is in the north. And Jesus actually then takes a band of followers and breaks off from John. I'm not implying break off as a fight, but like, let's split our efforts. And he goes down to the south and baptizes in Judea and ends up being more successful numbers-wise than John. So if John had thousands, Jesus maybe had multiple thousands or even more. Numbers aren't given. But where is he baptizing? Well, it could be that he's the one down around Qumran baptizing. Isn't that a new scene for a movie? Jesus baptizing down at Qumran rather than, and I don't mean at Qumran, but when you're standing at Qumran, you can see, up to Jericho and the Jordan River. So this is how the Jordan goes down to the south, and then finally you get down to the desert area. This is Cave 1. That's me standing in front of it. When it was found by the Bedouin in 47, this was all blocked up with stones purposely, and all you saw was this little hole. It's a fairly large cave, and it had 7 or 8 jars in it, and only one jar had scrolls. James Vanderkam, Peter Flint, I think it's called Understanding the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the only book that they've done together. That is the book to get. It's absolutely the best. It's in paperback. There's so many books on the scrolls. This one is so much better than any other book. I'm telling you that there's no use wasting your time reading the others first. Read this one first, then read all the other books, because you kind of have a basis then for judging, and they're very fair with the evidence. They do discuss all the theories, but they very convincingly show you that the consensus, look, I'm not a consensus kind of guy, I think you know that, right, on almost every subject. So if I say I generally agree with the consensus on the scrolls, I mean, that's like big. I should be like with Eisenman or something, but I'm not. I think they were written by the Essenes. I think all the basic scholarship on the scrolls is correct. I just have a lot of details to add. This is a photo of the community rule, so you get to see kind of like what they look like. They were stored so that the top and bottom parts, depending on how they were turned, did deteriorate a bit, but basically I think we have to be so happy that they look this good. Some of you have seen the actual scrolls and exhibits. Usually the impression people have is small and dark. I didn't know they were so tiny. They're like the pages of this book, and even smaller, and they're very dark, so that usually on the display a light goes on and then goes off. They've actually darkened with time because some of these photographs show that they're a bit lighter. This is what the settlement looks like from that big cave you see up above, which I call the Teacher's Cave. I'm a real romanticist when it comes to Qumran. I've spent many days, months there. I don't know total time. But right above, overlooking the settlement, is this huge cave. You've all seen it as you drive up. What's that big cave? So I call it the Teacher's Cave because I imagine the teacher sitting up there looking over his domain and thinking about what God has planned for him. Sort of like the cave of Muhammad or the cave of Moses. It's a really holy place to go to. It's not that hard because there's a path that goes up. These are my students, I always take them up there, and then you get this breathtaking view of the site. Here's a nice aerial shot taken by a helicopter or plane. These are the ruins of the settlement. Cave 4 is over here, and the rest of the caves except for 1 and 2, 3 and 11 are on this plateau. But this has been excavated, and there's a visitor center and so forth, as you'll see. There's a spring picture. I took that in the spring. And I took that, believe it or not, in April of '79. So it goes back a while. This is the dining hall or assembly room. Probably would hold about 80, 100 people. So don't think of this as the Essene movement as much, as the spiritual headquarters. This is West Point. This is Notre Dame. This is the spiritual headquarters. This is Ambassador College. This is, what's the Salt Lake City campus called?
Brigham Young.
This is Brigham Young. This is where you go to, well, in the days of the teacher, you go to be with the big guy, and it would be a privilege. So the ritual purity and the laws of keeping ritual purity are very, very strict. When you go out of the camp and when you come in, you have to do the mikvah. Well, that's not required within Judaism to go in and out of a city. You don't have to go to the mikvah. If you're going to the temple, you go to the mikvah. But they are the temple. So they're trying to impose a strict ritual purity. Has to do with, they talk about the pure meal of the saints. And I actually like that translation, saints, even though you should probably translate it holy ones, but I like to use the same terms the New Testament uses because they're exactly the same equivalent linguistically, to make people realize that this set of language is not unique to Christianity, but it would be true of any group within Judaism that thought of itself as sanctified, which means to be set apart as the true people of God. This is a group that thought they were the only ones saved, to put it in Christian terms. I grew up in the Church of Christ, a very strict, dogmatic Christian group, and the joke in town, if you've ever heard this joke, Methodists and Baptists tell it about Church of Christ people in the South, that everybody's up in heaven, and you have to be quiet if you pass Church of Christ people because they think they're the only ones there. So you go, shh. So this group thinks they're the only ones saved, and they make that very clear in the scrolls. They are the B'nai or the children of light. Everybody else are the children of darkness. You're predestined, but if you are a child of light, you will get the call, you'll get the pull, you'll know. It's very, very similar to Paul, who actually said that people being drawn to the community were chosen even before the foundation of the world. So this group, predestination is one of the dominant doctrines. Behind the settlement are these limestone cliffs with thousands and thousands of caves. I don't know if you can see in that picture, but you see these little cavities. Many of us interested in the scrolls, Charles Worth and I, have spent days and days and days going in every single cave. Lots of other people have. We probably found anything that's obvious, meaning we found nothing, but a few people have found a few things, but no scrolls ever since the 50s. I think we need to be on the other side of the Jordan. My sense is that the real stuff is hidden on the other side, right across from Qumran. I didn't make this point, but why are they located just across Why are they located right there at Qumran? Because it's exactly across from Pisgah and Nebo and the valley of Beit Peor where Moses is buried. And I think they are of the tradition that the Ark of the Covenant was hidden in a cave, read 2 Maccabees, and Moses, it's near where Moses was buried, and this is where the redemption will be staged once again. In the book of Isaiah, Jehovah is going to come up from Edom. He's going to march like a warrior up through the deserts, just like he left in Ezekiel 10 over the Mount of Olives and out into the desert. He's going to come back. So they're placing themselves on the right, on the left turn. If you come up from the south, who is this that comes from Edom with garments stained with blood? Is it not the Lord Jehovah? So he's going to march up on the day of the Lord. When he gets to the tip of the Dead Sea, he's got to make a left turn to go to Jerusalem. Look where they're stationed. This is like Tamar catching Judah on that corner. And he's got to go by. And when he goes by, they're going to go, hey, here we are. We're the sons of light. We're waiting for you. And they're going to go with him. Led by their two messiahs, who by then will have showed up. Remember what I said on Monday? The messiahs never came. And it's to their credit, I think, that they just kept waiting rather than somebody appointing themselves. We have no record of anybody coming along saying, oh, I'm the Davidic Messiah, or I'm the Aaronic Messiah. And so the teacher came and went, and 40 years passed, and so forth. One of the things Stephen Fawn has studied very extensively is the pantry off to the side of the dining hall on the left. And it really shows, I think, very strongly that a sectarian group lived at Qumran. It's like 48 cups, 47 saucers. One got broken, I guess, and so forth. And they all look the same, and there's no decoration, and they're plain ware. These people believe in ritual purity. I doubt if they would use cups or ceramic from the marketplace. Even though you can mikvah your dishes, dip them in water and purify them, I'm thinking that they probably are very interested in just buying Essene goods. Again, this is common among certain sectarian groups, like buy your own people's stuff, but this is for ritual purity reasons, not just business. Now, what about the idea that you probably read in Barr recently, and Herschel's really leaning this way, and I don't know why people can't understand how this fits perfectly with what I think and others think, that it's a clay manufacturing place, right? This is the latest theory. Of course it is. Because at the spiritual headquarters, one of the main things you need to do is produce the pottery for the whole movement worldwide, particularly in the land of Israel. And so you have this clay facility, and I think there was clay manufacturing going on. And I think it fits perfectly well with the sectarian group. I don't think it's a country villa. I don't think it's a military fortress. These are other ideas. But I don't think it's just somewhere where people sat and contemplated their navels, so to speak, and thought spiritual thoughts. They do farm. They have animals. They have to live. And their main purpose is to represent the movement. Here's a nice drawing of Hirschfeld. Thank you, Yitzhar, even though you think it's a country villa, because it really gives you an idea. When you come into the camp, you go into the mikvah, and then now you're in the holy perimeters. There's a tower here that's a watchtower and a defense tower. The teacher lives, I think, in this upper apartment because it has white plastered walls. And I think he's in this area here. When he dies, he's buried in a mausoleum right over here, and that's actually been excavated. I don't know if we'll be able to see it in this picture, the mausoleum or not. Basically, you've got the site. This is the cemetery. These are shaft graves. They go down about 6 feet, and then they angle, and the body's put down in the slot of the angle, and then soil and stones are piled on top, so you have these sort of grave markers. This is Clermont-Ganneau's drawing in the 1870s and a more accurate drawing today, and that's the mausoleum where we think the teacher was buried. It's about 1,100 graves. And now that Josias has dispelled the idea that the women, there are some women, these graves that are pointed north-south did have some women, but we now know those were Bedouin women. They're late burials. So for years there are all these discussions about, well, they had a few women. Now, all the graves have not been opened. The dark ones you see are the ones that have been opened. It's not very many, it's about 40. And it's all male. It's a male cemetery. That's going to be hard to account for. First of all, having a cemetery this large next to your country villa, and also having it all male. No ritual items buried with the bodies, no jewelry, no weapons, nothing. Just wrapped in a linen shroud and put in the grave. Why north-south? Nobody really knows, but the best speculation, I think, is that, I mean, Jews should be buried no matter where they are in the world so that their feet are towards Jerusalem, and then when they rise up, the first thing they'll see is the light of the Lord appearing in Jerusalem, right? At the resurrection. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But they're taking the resurrection very literally. They're going to miss the stuff in Jerusalem. They're looking up north. And the reason they're looking up north, I think, this is just a guess, is based on Isaiah. It's the same reason the Christians look north. Isaiah says that where there was deep darkness, the land of deep darkness, the land of Zebulun and Naphtali up by the Galilee, will appear a great light. And then he defines that great light as the Davidic Messiah. So they're expecting the Davidic Messiah to come from the north. That's my guess. I can't prove it. I mean, whenever anthropologists and archaeologists dig stones and dig materials that can't speak unless you have a text. So there's no text that said, we bury facing the north because the Messiah is going to come from the north. So, but it's so odd to do, you know, for a Jewish group, not to be facing Jerusalem. You have to look for an explanation. And to me, I find this very convincing, at least as a hypothesis. They're waiting for the light from the north. So isn't that interesting that when Jesus comes along 100 years later, there's a lot of discussion about, well, you're from the north. Is that a problem or is that not a problem? Shouldn't the Messiah be from Bethlehem? But apparently there are other groups that say, no, he should come from the north. And that text, it's Isaiah 9, I think, is quoted in the New Testament. There's another view of the cemetery showing you more how the building is located. And there's a close-up of the graves. They're just piles of stone. And it's illegal to dig these, of course. You can't dig a Jewish grave. This is the text that I mentioned that was found in 96. If you know Hebrew, you can read the first lines because it says Shnat Stayim in the year 2. So we think year 2 of the revolt, just like the coins. Isn't that cool to have a text that's dated 68 AD? The revolt was in 66. And Choni is going to give all his stuff to the Yachad. And there's the Yachad, but like the Gospel of Philip, part of this is broken off so that Norman Golb and others would say, well, maybe it didn't say to the Yachad, maybe it says to the Yachar or something else. But we're pretty sure it's to the Yachad. So what it tells us, first of all, it's just wonderful to have a text from Qumran. Remember, the scrolls were in caves around. But here's a text from Qumran. And secondly, it captures that moment, that great dramatic moment when the 10th Legion is coming down to burn Jericho. And some guy from Jericho is still, maybe he's like Constantine who put off his baptism till the end. He goes like, well, I'm going to go join God's people because, you know, the end is definitely coming. I've heard that Jerusalem is surrounded by armies and so forth. One other thing I'm not going to dwell on because it would take too long to get into it, and I want to do this other document with you. But Josias and I, Joe's my friend, as you know, at least on this subject. If you know anything about Joe and I, he disagrees with me very strongly about the Talpiot tomb and my book, The Jesus Dynasty. But we did collaborate on finding the latrines at Qumran. And to the northwest of Qumran is an area that we have now identified as their latrines. And this has to do with them believing that you need to go outside the camp and have the toilets outside. In Jerusalem, they're having toilets inside. They're also having sex in the city. That's actually mentioned. Is that the name of an HBO series? No. Sex and the City. I'm just kidding you. So they actually say that one of the great reasons God is not blessing the people of Israel is because people are having sex in the holy city of Jerusalem, which you would normally think, well, so they've extended the notion of holiness to the whole city of Jerusalem, therefore it's defiled. And obviously they're not going to have sex at Qumran. Why are you keeping out the sex? It's not because women are evil or horrible or whatever. It's because of with a sexual life goes the impurity of blood, semen, and so forth. And if you eliminate sexuality, you eliminate several of the causes of ritual impurity. I think that's basically it, because they do allow marriage. You know, according to Josephus, they marry, and they're two different groups, and some of them marry and some of them don't. Was Jesus an Essene? What I want to do is talk about just the scrolls and the latest on the scrolls. I've already alluded to some of this. But starting with what do we know about the Essenes, here are the classical sources. And these are all in Flynn and Vanderkam's book. So if you get the book, you won't have to go look up Pliny and Philo and so forth. You have all the quotes in full with discussion. It's absolutely a great book to get. So, in other words, we know of a group from Josephus primarily, but also from Pliny and Philo, called the Essenes, and they're thoroughly described by Josephus in Book 2 of the Jewish War. This is not it, but I'm picking up for effectiveness here. So Book 2 of the Jewish War that I brought last time. And the description does not mention anything like apocalyptic, messianic, or anything like that. So you'd think, well, that's not the scroll, that's not the group that wrote the scrolls. But in terms of their sociological habits, their makeup, their organization, their rituals, there are many, many parallels. And Flynn and Vanderkam list them, and they're very, very impressive with the sacred meals and the organization and so forth. So the question, the pinpoint questions to look at in all this controversy in this lecture is like, what should we really think about the Dead Sea Scrolls after all these years? You know, they're all out now, and we've had another 15, 20 years to think about it. So what should we think? You should think what I'm going to tell you right now. Are the scrolls connected to the site of Qumran? Yes. Okay? Absolutely. In other words, you study the scrolls, you study the site, you study the site, you study the scrolls. If you don't believe that, read Flint and Vanderkam or read Jody Magnus. Jody Magnus is so strong on this, her book on Qumran, it shuts the case. It's over. I mean, she does the archaeology, she does the history, she does her Jody thing, and basically every mouth is stopped because she happens to be right on this subject. Is the group that wrote the scrolls one known or unknown to us from other sources? You see how those are separate questions. Notice you could say, okay, I've got the scrolls, I've got the site. Do they go together? Answer yes. Okay, the scrolls describe a group. Is the group only known to me in the scrolls, or could I go to other literary sources and get some other information on the group? I would say the answer is a big yes. And in fact, it's the group otherwise known as the Essenes. So here's where people miss this. It doesn't mean that everything Josephus says about the Essenes will fit what we know about the group from the scrolls. Think of the Pharisees. He also describes the Pharisees. That would be like saying, you know, I don't think this is the Pharisees because I've read the Mishnah and I've read Josephus. The Mishnah tells me, like Pirkei Avot, what the Pharisees really believe, like the scrolls tell you. And Josephus describes the scrolls, the Pharisees, more like Stoic philosophers. They don't sound like rabbis. Josephus is trying to please Vespasian. What he does is very simple. If you read it, it is transparent. He's saying to Vespasian, whenever you read the Jewish War, remember, Vespasian is looking over his shoulder, literally, as he writes. He's living in Vespasian's palace. He's paid by Vespasian. The meals are catered in by the emperor himself. He has evening discussions with the emperor. How's the Jewish War coming? Could I see another chapter? It's going to be a pro-Roman document, but Josephus is very smart. He's going to figure out, it's pro-Roman, but I'm going to show this guy that we are a great people. And even though he defeated us, he needs to know how noble and wonderful we are, except for those stupid fanatics that, would resist Rome. So that's his approach. So what does he do? He says, we're sort of like you. We have Pythagorean type people, Essenes. Well, Pythagoreans are very popular in the Roman world. You don't want to be one, but you want to admire them. That's like becoming a Buddhist monk or something, or a Catholic priest. Like, God, wow, you're going to do that? That's pretty dedicated. I'm not going to do it, but I'm going to give you credit for that dedication. So that's Pythagoreans. And the Pharisees, they're like Stoics, right? And it all turns on, do they believe in fate or not fate? And the Sadducees are like who? Who's the hated group in the Roman world? Epicureans. In other words, death is death. When you die, that's it. There's no meaning to anything, and nothing's fated, everything's chance, and so forth. It's like Epicureans, Lucretius. Well, that's like the Sadducees. It's not exactly parallel, but he's trying to tell Vespasian, we got all that stuff that you got. So, of course, the description of the Essenes will not match the scrolls. He's not going to tell them, because I think he likes the Essenes. He likes all the Jewish groups. He was an Essene for a while. He tells you that. He doesn't use the name, but he said, I studied with Banus in the desert as a young man, and went through all this period, and then later I became a Pharisee. Sort of like what you do in your old age. You become a Pharisee, move into town, get a villa, get a wife or two. I think Josephus had 4 wives altogether, and he was not so lucky in marriage. So when he says, the Essenes are very wise, they know not to trust women, and that's why they don't get married, because they know the truth that we all men know, that all of us men know, that no woman has ever been trustworthy. They're all going to wrong you, they're going to two-time you, they're going to cheat you, going to manipulate you, they're going to commit adultery, they're going to just completely work you over. And aren't the Essenes wonderful because they know that? Well, Vespasian's going to actually like that. Because Romans, all men like women, at least most men like women, but Romans like men and women, but they do like women. But they also, if you know the history of the imperial family and then into Vespasian is not part of the Julio-Claudian line, but half the story is always the women behind the scenes. Like Nero's mother is more important than Nero, right? And Augustus's second wife, and so forth. If you trace the women of the emperors, you really get the real story about who's doing things. So Vespasian would even like that. Okay, I mentioned Jody's book. Was Qumran a villa, a fortress, or a sectarian religious establishment center? Jody, I think, has shown very, very clearly, absolutely for sure, it is a sectarian community. This is very helpful then. Now, we don't want to go as far as Roland DeVoe, Father DeVoe, and say, oh, they're kind of like Catholic monks. Here's the scriptorium and here's the dining hall where they all eat. But they are kind of like Catholic monks in the sense that any monastic male movement is going to have some similar characteristics if they have vows of poverty and vows of chastity. Like a bunch of men meeting together, wearing single clothing, meeting for common meals at certain times of the day. It's just going to be that way, but they're not singing Latin hymns to Christ, right? They're singing songs to their God, to Hashem. They also have very strict rules about decorum. Like if your robe comes open, you don't wear underwear in the ancient world, by the way. So if your robe comes open, we're going to see your genitals. And that's an offense. And a brother has now seen your nakedness, so you've got to go out of the camp for like 30 days or whatever. And you live in a cave that we've now excavated, these caves that we think are the outlying caves where you live. And you're given food and water and everything, but basically you just sit in your cave until your time's over because you've defiled the camp. If you spit inside the community, you better go outside and do your spitting. If you pee or anything else, or if you ejaculate. One of the guys is chastised at Qumran for being in love with his own bodily fluids. Apparently he was caught at night by maybe a brother who said, "What are you doing over there?" And he was exposed. So they're very strict. As far as the name, Steve Gordonson has made the point that Essenoi can be osanoi in Hebrew or osim, the doers of the law, and I think that's very convincing. So you say, well, the word Essenes not there. No, Essenes Greek, but osim is there. And they did call themselves the doers. Romans 2, Paul talks about the doers. Very interesting. And also language like children of light. Now, you can read this yourself because I don't want to go over time because of lunch. But here you have your 7 parallels between the Jesus movement and the Dead Sea Scrolls with the references. I think these are very, very, I'm just going to read the names of them. You can look them up. Separation and preparing the way in the wilderness, number 1. And that this is the time. Secondly, you go into the wilderness. Thirdly, you are waiting for the Messiahs to come. The new covenant, they talk about we're the people of the new covenant. Baptism, we call it. They call it mikvah, but it's not the normal mikvah for menstruation and sexual intercourse and touching a dead body. This is baptism into the community. Notice you sprinkle pure water and you become clean. It's very similar to the baptism of John the Baptist. Temple is the people, you see right here. He's commanded that a sanctuary of men be built for him. There they may send up, like the smoke of incense, the works of the Torah. The ma'aseh ha-Torah, works of the law, which Paul also refers to. Same phrase. So Paul really is important in terms of this material. Paul would see these people as trying to earn their salvation. You also atone for sins, not with sacrifices and not with the blood of Jesus, right, but with prayer here, with prayers. And then here you give all of your possessions over, so communal living and so forth. Now, these are unresolved issues. Pacifism, celibacy, slavery, oaths, sacrifice, and the calendar are things that differ in the scrolls and in the descriptions of the Essenes. And so we're not sure how to resolve all those, but they're discussed in Vanderkam and Flint. And finally, before you think Jesus is an Essene, I mean, he's doing this new covenant, sacred meal, you are the temple. I mean, there's so many parallels. But as far as their interpretation of the Torah, they would hate him. In other words, what you have is a very, very liberal and very, very conservative approach to a general matrix of apocalyptic Judaism. I agree with Eisenman. This is the Messianic movement of Palestine from the Maccabees to Bar Kokhba. It's one singular movement, meaning there are all these perceptions that are shared, like God is going to redeem his people, he's going to bring home the lost tribes, he's going to raise up the Messiah, he's going to bring the judgment, going to raise the dead. This whole set of shared perceptions, but in terms of how you live to make that happen and be the acceptable group, you're going to have over on the left a group that says we can hang out with Samaritans, we can talk to women, we can even touch unclean people, and it's not such a big thing to God because God looks at the heart, and what goes in the mouth does not defile, but what comes out of the heart, and that sort of thing. And then a very strict group that says if your animal falls in the pit on the Sabbath, the well, do not pull it out. Leave the animal with a broken leg crying and screaming because, after all, God said rest on Shabbat. Or you cannot go to the toilet on Shabbat. I'll end with this comical thing that my students all laugh at. Why can't you go to the toilet on Shabbat? We're talking about defecation, probably urination they probably could get by with over against a wall or something. After all, it's guys, right? They can do it quick. But because you're not allowed on Shabbat to travel more than 2,000 cubits, and the latrines have to be located outside the camp. So therefore, by deduction, which law are you going to break? You going to break the Sabbath day journey, or are you going to go inside the camp to the toilet? So Josephus mentions this. I think it's the great parallel between the Essenes and Qumran, now that we've found the latrines. And they're at the right distance northwest of the camp. Why is it such a great parallel? Because who in their right mind would go for this except a group that is thinking, I mean, it's not a very practical thing. Believe me, the Pharisees would figure out a way around this, and they did. They redefined the camp. You know, they defined the camp in other ways. Jews walk all over Jerusalem today on the Sabbath. You can walk miles and miles and miles. Why haven't you gone outside the camp? You've gone way over 2,000 cubits. Because there's a string around the whole city of Jerusalem. It's a little thin string that they have strung, and it has to be repaired occasionally, because if it's cut, then everybody's sinned. And then they declare, this is our camp. Well, then you can do anything you want in the camp. But they're not following the latrine rule, are they? Remember in the Torah it says you shall not go to the toilet in the camp. You think nobody's going to the restroom in all of Jerusalem for 24 hours? I'm sorry. So that one's just ignored. But these people are not going to ignore it. So they would have hated Jesus. They would have said, you know, new covenant, baptism, all that's fine. But you're talking to women, Samaritans, you don't wash your hands before you eat. You don't follow a lot of these, halakhic rulings. I saw you pouring some liquid out of one cup into another cup, and now you're using that cup. Don't you know that defiled the cup? You're not watching your P's and Q's on those things. And Jesus was more of a Pharisee in that way, and actually maybe even to the left of the Pharisees. So no, he wasn't an Essene, but what I would say is both Jesus and the scroll group are part of the Messianic movement in Palestine. And they represent two wings of it. John and James, I think, Jesus is over here, John and James are sort of here, you see? And then the Qumran community is way over here, and then there's probably the whole range of people in the middle. It's a movement. It's very similar, I think, sociologically to, say, the Baptists in America, because that's a biblically based, very diverse group. So you've got primitive Baptists that would say Southern Baptists are going to hell. They're too liberal. And you've got Southern Baptists that definitely think American Baptists are going to hell. So you see, but they're all Baptists, and they basically have this sort of evangelical preaching heritage, this sort of Billy Graham type outlook on life. So to an outsider, they're the same, right? So anyway, that's the latest on the scrolls in my view as to their significance. I hope you will read them and read the books I've recommended, Jody Magnus, Vanderkam, and Flint. If you will read those books and the scrolls, you will be very, very well informed on this subject. And you can then read all these Bar articles and really follow the story. Bar has published so much on this that in the archive, if you decide to buy the archive CD, it's really worth having. Don't dare type in Qumran, because it'll probably break your hard drive. I mean, your memory will. I mean, there will be so many articles on Qumran, because Herschel, of course, has been very interested in that. But you would really get all the arguments just in Bar magazine. But you should